What happens when the reality you believe to be solid, predictable, begins to dissolve? When what you see in the sky defies everything you've learned about physics, about possibility, about what is real? And more importantly, when millions of people see the same thing, when collective perception shifts, does reality itself shift with it? Welcome to the Quantum Soul. Today, we're exploring a perspective that connects UAPs, global events, and the collective psyche in a way you've probably never encountered.
And this isn't vague speculation, right? There are serious people studying this, physicists looking at UAPs and saying, wait, this doesn't fit what we understand about space-time.
What happens when the reality you believe to be solid, predictable, begins to dissolve? When what you see in the sky defies everything you've learned about physics, about possibility, about what is real? And more importantly, when millions of people see the same thing, when collective perception shifts, does reality itself shift with it? Welcome to the Quantum Soul. Today, we're exploring a perspective that connects UAPs, global events, and the collective psyche in a way you've probably never encountered.
And this isn't vague speculation, right? There are serious people studying this. Physicists looking at UAPs and saying, wait, this doesn't fit what we understand about space-time. There's research suggesting that consciousness and these phenomena aren't separate. They're entangled.
Exactly. And that's why we're here, because there's a conversation happening, quiet but happening, about what's really at stake when we talk about UAPs, global shifts, collective consciousness. But let me be clear from the start, we're not coming here with ready-made answers. We're exploring questions. Questions that mainstream science avoids, that media won't touch, but that any thinking person is asking themselves.
Like, why do UAPs appear during moments of global tension? Why does the official narrative change every week? And, this is the big one, is our perception of these phenomena literally shaping what they are? Now, that sounds mystical, I know, but there's substance to it. There's research showing that the observer, your consciousness, actually affects the outcome of reality at the quantum level. It's not metaphor, it's reproducible, it's physics. So when we talk about consciousness and UAPs being connected, we're not being mystical. We're being consistent with what physics has already discovered.
And this is where Darius Wright's framework becomes crucial. He talks about construct reality, the idea that reality isn't a fixed thing happening to us, but something we're co-creating through our consciousness. If that's true, then UAPs aren't just objects in the sky, there's something else entirely.
Like what? A mirror. They're a mirror of what's happening in collective consciousness. But also, and this is important, they might be a catalyst, a trigger that forces us to expand what we think is possible.
Okay, but that's a big leap. You're saying UAPs are a reflection of our collective mind.
Not just a reflection, an interaction. Think about it. If consciousness and physical reality are entangled, and quantum mechanics suggests they are, then UAPs appearing during moments of collective anxiety, collective awakening, collective fear, that's not coincidence. That's resonance.
Resonance, like they're responding to something.
Or we're creating the conditions for them to appear, or both. The point is, reality is more participatory than we've been taught. You're not a passive observer. You're an active participant in what manifests.
But here's where I get skeptical, and I mean this constructively. If that's true, then why don't we see UAPs every day? Why are they rare? Why the mystery?
Because most people aren't looking. Most people's consciousness is locked into a very narrow bandwidth of perception. We're trained to see what we expect to see. We're trained to dismiss what doesn't fit our narrative.
So UAPs are appearing, but we're filtering them out?
Partially, but also there's something else. There's what you might call a perceptual war happening. Different narratives competing for control of how we interpret reality. And whoever controls the narrative controls what becomes real in the collective consciousness.
Now that I can see. That's happening right now. Different groups telling completely different stories about the same events.
Exactly. And Darius points out something crucial here. There's a difference between what he calls soul intelligence and brain thinking. Brain thinking is linear, reactive, filtered through fear and bias. Soul intelligence is intuitive, direct, unfiltered.
And you're saying the narrative war is happening at the level of which one we're using?
Precisely. If you're operating from brain thinking, fear, skepticism, need for external authority, you'll interpret UAPs one way. If you're operating from soul intelligence, direct knowing, intuition, trust in your own perception, you'll interpret them completely differently.
So the same phenomenon, two completely different realities depending on which consciousness you're accessing.
Now you've got it. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because if that's true, then understanding UAPs isn't about getting the right answer externally. It's about upgrading your own consciousness to perceive what's actually happening.
Which brings us back to Darius, because he's not just theorizing about this. He's offering a method, a way to actually access these different levels of consciousness.
Right, and that's what we're going to explore today. Not just the what. What are UAPs, what's happening globally, but the how. How do you access the consciousness that can actually perceive and understand what's really going on?
Because if you don't upgrade your consciousness, you're just going to keep interpreting everything through the same filters that got us here in the first place.
Exactly. You'll keep seeing what you've always seen. You'll keep believing what you've always believed. And the mystery will stay a mystery.
So let's start there. Let's understand what Darius means by construct reality, because that's the foundation for everything we're going to talk about.
Okay, so let's break this down. When Darius talks about construct reality, what exactly is he saying? Because it sounds like he's saying reality is fake, and I don't think that's what he means.
No, it's the opposite, actually. He's saying reality is more real than we think, but not in the way we've been taught. See, we've been conditioned to believe that reality is this objective, fixed thing that exists independently of us, that we're observers looking at it from the outside.
Right, like reality is a stage and we're just watching it happen.
Exactly. But Darius, and this connects to what quantum mechanics is showing us, says that's fundamentally wrong. Reality isn't a stage, it's more like a collaborative creation. You're not separate from it, you're embedded in it. Your consciousness is actively participating in what manifests.
But that sounds like I'm responsible for everything that happens. Like, if there's a war somewhere, I created it?
Not you individually, but consciousness collectively. Think about it this way. What we call reality is actually the consensus of what billions of minds are agreeing is real. And that consensus is constantly shifting based on what we're paying attention to, what we believe is possible, what we're afraid of.
So it's like a shared hallucination?
No, because hallucinations aren't shared. But what if reality is something more like a shared field of possibility? And depending on where the collective consciousness is focused, different possibilities collapse into what we experience as reality.
Now you're talking about quantum mechanics again.
Exactly. At the quantum level, particles exist in a state of superposition, multiple possibilities at once, until they're observed. The act of observation collapses those possibilities into one reality. Now, scale that up. If consciousness affects quantum reality at the micro level, why wouldn't it affect reality at the macro level?
Because there are billions of us. Wouldn't that average out? Wouldn't we all just see the same thing?
We do see mostly the same thing, but not because reality is forcing us to. It's because we're all operating from similar belief systems, similar narratives, similar fears. We're all tuned to the same frequency, so we all perceive the same reality.
But people disagreed about reality all the time. Different political groups see the same events completely differently.
Exactly. And that's the key insight. Those aren't just different opinions, those are different realities. Because if your consciousness is shaped by different beliefs, different fears, different narratives, you literally perceive a different world. You see different things. You remember things differently. You interpret events differently.
Okay, but there's still an objective reality, right? Like a building either exists or it doesn't.
Does it? Or does it exist in the way we've collectively agreed it exists? I mean, yes, there's something there. But what that something is, how it behaves, what it means, that's all constructed through consciousness.
This is where I need to push back a little, because if reality is just constructed, then why can't I just decide that gravity doesn't exist and float away?
Because you're not the only consciousness here. You're embedded in a collective consciousness that has agreed very strongly that gravity exists. And that collective agreement is very powerful. It's been reinforced for centuries. It's in our culture, our science, our language, our bodies.
So I'm trapped by the collective belief?
Not trapped, participating. You're part of creating that collective agreement. And here's where it gets interesting. Darius says that's exactly what's happening with global events right now. Wars, climate change, economic collapse, UAPs, these aren't random events happening to us. They're manifestations of the collective consciousness.
Wait, so we're creating wars through our consciousness?
Not consciously, no, but unconsciously, yes. Through our fears, our beliefs about scarcity, our narratives about us versus them, our acceptance of violence as inevitable, we're creating the conditions for conflict. We're literally constructing a reality where war is possible, even necessary.
That's actually kind of dark.
It is. But here's the liberating part. If we're constructing it unconsciously, then we can construct it consciously. If we change the collective consciousness, the beliefs, the narratives, the fears, we change what manifests in reality.
So that's where Jung comes in, the collective unconscious.
Exactly. Jung talked about the collective unconscious as this shared psychological space, archetypes, symbols, patterns that all humans share. Darius takes that further. He says the collective unconscious isn't just psychological, it's the actual blueprint of reality. It's the field from which all manifestation emerges.
So events in the world are like symptoms of what's happening in the collective unconscious?
More than symptoms, they're expressions, direct expressions. When there's collective fear, we see that fear manifest as conflict, as disease, as environmental collapse. When there's collective awakening, we see that manifest as innovation, as connection, as new possibilities emerging.
And UAPs? Where did they fit into this?
UAPs are fascinating because they're appearing right now at a moment when the collective consciousness is in crisis. We're questioning everything, authority, reality, what's possible. And suddenly, these objects appear in the sky that completely challenge our understanding of what's possible. It's like the universe is responding to our collective readiness to expand.
Or we're hallucinating them because we're anxious.
Could be. But here's the thing. Does it matter? If millions of people are perceiving the same thing, if it's affecting policy, if it's changing how we think about reality, then it's real. It's real because it's real in the collective consciousness. It's shaping what we believe is possible.
So Darius would say that UAPs are real because we've collectively agreed they're real?
Not just agreed, co-created. We've created the conditions through our consciousness, our beliefs, our readiness for them to appear. Whether they're physical objects or interdimensional phenomena or something we don't have language for yet, they're real because they're manifesting in our shared reality.
Okay, but that still feels abstract. Like, how does this actually work? Like, mechanically, how does consciousness create reality?
That's the question, right? And Darius doesn't claim to have all the answers, but he points to something that's being researched. Fields. Morphic fields. Quantum fields. Information fields. The idea that consciousness isn't just in your brain, it's a field that extends beyond your body, that connects you to everything else.
Like telepathy?
More fundamental than that. Like, consciousness is the fabric of reality itself, and your individual consciousness is like a localized pattern in that fabric. You're not separate from it, you're an expression of it. And when you change your consciousness, your beliefs, your attention, your intention, you're literally reshaping the field, and that reshaping manifests as changes in reality.
So if enough people change their consciousness, reality changes.
Exactly. And that's what Darius is talking about when he says something big is happening. He's saying that the collective consciousness is at a tipping point. We're being forced to expand through crises, through UAPs, through everything falling apart. And as we expand, we're literally creating a new reality.
A new construct?
A new construct. One where we understand that we're not victims of reality, we're creators of it. And that changes everything.
All right, so if that's true, if we're creating reality through consciousness, then the question becomes, who's controlling the narrative? Who's controlling what we believe is real?
Now you're asking the right question, because if reality is constructed through consciousness, then controlling consciousness means controlling reality. And that's exactly what's happening right now.
That's what we need to explore next, the narrative war. Because if what you're saying is true, then the battle isn't really about politics or economics or even UAPs. It's about who gets to define what's real.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because Darius talks about how to reclaim that power, how to access the consciousness that can perceive beyond the narratives, how to become what he calls irreplaceable. A consciousness that can't be controlled or manipulated because it's accessing truth directly.
Okay, so we're getting there. But first, let's talk about how the narratives are actually being constructed. How are we being manipulated into believing certain things are real and others aren't?
That's the next layer. And it's where things get uncomfortable. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it.
All right, so we've established that consciousness and reality are entangled. We're co-creating the construct through our collective beliefs and narratives. Now let's talk about UAP specifically. Why are they appearing now? What's their role in all of this?
Darius has a really interesting take on this. He says UAPs aren't just anomalies or military technology or even extraterrestrial visitors, though they could be any of those things. He says they're catalysts. They're forcing the collective consciousness to expand beyond its current construct.
Catalysts for what exactly?
For awakening, for questioning, for recognizing that reality is much larger than we've been told. See, the current construct, the one we've been unconsciously creating, is built on very specific assumptions. That reality is material, that consciousness is produced by the brain, that what we can't measure doesn't exist, that we're isolated individuals in a dead universe.
The materialist worldview.
Exactly. And UAPs are challenging every single one of those assumptions. They're appearing in ways that defy our physics. They're moving in ways that shouldn't be possible. They're being witnessed by credible observers, pilots, military personnel, scientists. And they're forcing us to ask, what if our assumptions are wrong?
But couldn't they just be advanced human technology or natural phenomena we don't understand yet?
Maybe, and that's actually part of the point. The official narrative keeps shifting. First, they don't exist. Then they're weather balloons. Then they're classified military technology. Then they're unidentified. The narrative keeps changing because the phenomenon doesn't fit into any single category. It's forcing us to expand our categories.
So the mystery itself is the catalyst.
Partially, but also consider the timing. UAPs started appearing more frequently and more openly right when the collective consciousness was reaching a breaking point. Climate crisis, political polarization, economic instability, pandemic.
We're all feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with the current system, and then UAPs show up, as if to say, your understanding of reality is incomplete.
That's very poetic. But is there evidence for this connection?
Well, consider what Jung called synchronicity. He documented cases where external events aligned with collective psychological states in meaningful ways. He said these weren't coincidences, they were expressions of the collective unconscious manifesting in the physical world. UAPs appearing during a time of collective crisis could be understood as synchronicity on a massive scale.
So the universe is responding to our consciousness?
Or consciousness and the universe are expressions of the same thing. Darius talks about this. He says consciousness isn't something that exists in the universe. Consciousness is the universe. Matter, energy, information, they're all expressions of consciousness. So when the collective consciousness reaches a certain point of readiness or crisis, phenomena emerge that match that state.
But that seems to give consciousness too much power. Like, we're responsible for UAPs appearing.
Not responsible in a blame sense, but yes, participatory. We're creating the conditions through our beliefs, our fears, our readiness to expand for certain phenomena to manifest. And Darius would say that UAPs are one of those phenomena. They're appearing because we're ready for them, because we need them, because the collective consciousness is calling for something that will break us out of the current construct.
Okay, but let's talk about the interstellar object, that phenomenon you mentioned in the original outline. How does that fit into this?
Interstellar objects are interesting because they're physical objects. We can measure them, track them, study them. They're not ambiguous like UAPs, but they serve a similar function. They're a reminder that we're not alone in the universe, that there are forces and phenomena beyond our control, beyond our understanding, and that can be destabilizing or liberating depending on your perspective.
Destabilizing how?
Because it challenges the illusion of control. We like to think we understand our world, that we're in charge, that we can predict and manage everything. An interstellar object, something that came from outside our solar system that we didn't see coming, that shatters that illusion. It forces us to recognize our smallness, our ignorance, our vulnerability.
And that's liberating?
It can be, because once you accept that you don't understand everything, that there are forces beyond your control, you can stop trying to control everything. You can start to trust. You can start to be open to possibilities you never considered before. And that openness is what allows the construct to shift.
So both UAPs and interstellar objects are serving the same function. They're breaking our certainty?
Exactly. And Darius talks about this in terms of what he calls dimensional awareness. He says most people are locked into perceiving only 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. But consciousness can access other dimensions, other layers of reality, and phenomena like UAPs and interstellar objects are hints that those other dimensions exist.
Other dimensions like what? Are we talking science fiction here?
Not science fiction, theoretical physics. String theory suggests there are at least 10 or 11 dimensions. Most of them are compactified, too small for us to perceive with our current instruments or consciousness. But what if some phenomena like UAPs, synchronicities, consciousness itself are expressions of those other dimensions bleeding through into our 3-dimensional perception?
So UAPs could be objects from other dimensions.
Or consciousness from other dimensions. Or information. The point is, they're challenging our dimensional assumptions. They're forcing us to expand what we think is possible, and that expansion of consciousness is what allows us to access dimensional awareness, the ability to perceive and interact with reality beyond the 3-dimensional construct we're locked into.
And Darius has experienced this through OBEs?
Yes, he talks about navigating multiple realms through out-of-body experiences. He says these aren't hallucinations or dreams, they're actual explorations of other dimensions of consciousness. And from those explorations, he's developed a map of how consciousness works, how reality is constructed, and how we can access higher dimensions of awareness.
But how do we know he's not just having vivid dreams?
Fair question, and Darius would say, you don't know until you try it yourself. He's not asking for blind belief. He's offering a method, the AYDA method, that allows anyone to access these states and verify for themselves. It's empirical in that sense. You can test it.
Okay, so UAPs and interstellar objects are catalysts that are forcing us to expand our consciousness. They're breaking our certainty about what's possible, and that expansion of consciousness is what is necessary for us to shift from the current construct, based on materialism and separation, to a new construct based on consciousness and connection.
Exactly. And here's the crucial part. This shift isn't happening passively. There's a battle happening right now for control of how we interpret these phenomena. There are narratives competing for dominance, and whoever controls the narrative controls what becomes real in the collective consciousness.
That's the narrative war you mentioned earlier.
That's it. And we need to understand how it works, because if we don't, we're just going to keep accepting whatever the authorities feed us. We're going to keep being locked into the current construct, and we're going to miss the opportunity that UAPs and these other phenomena are offering us.
Which is?
To wake up, to recognize our power, to understand that we're not victims of reality, we're creators of it. And once we understand that, everything changes.
All right, so let's talk about the narrative war. How are these narratives being constructed? Who's controlling them? And how do we break free from them?
Now that's where things get really interesting, because the narrative war isn't just about UAPs. It's about consciousness itself. It's about who gets to define what's real.
Okay, so you're saying there's a war happening for control of the narrative, but that sounds like a conspiracy theory. How is that different from just blaming some shadowy group for everything?
Good question. Because it's not about a conspiracy, it's about systems. It's about how power works. See, if Darius is right, if consciousness creates reality, then controlling consciousness means controlling reality. And institutions have always known this, even if they don't use that language.
Institutions? What kind of institutions?
All of them. Media, education, government, science, religion, they all operate on narratives. They all tell stories about what's real, what's possible, what you should believe. And those narratives shape how people perceive the world. They shape what becomes real in the collective consciousness.
But people have agency, right? We can choose what we believe.
Can we? Or are we choosing from a very limited menu of pre-approved options? Think about it. Where do you get your information? Media outlets. Where do you learn what's true? Educational institutions. Where do you get your sense of what's possible? The culture around you. And all of those are controlled or influenced by people with specific interests.
So we're being manipulated?
Not necessarily intentionally, but yes, our perception is being shaped. And Darius talks about this in terms of what he calls perceptual filters. He says most people are operating through very narrow perceptual filters, filters that were installed by culture, by education, by trauma, by the narratives we've absorbed.
Perceptual filters.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You're walking through the world and you're perceiving reality through filters. Those filters determine what you notice and what you ignore, what you consider possible and what you consider impossible, what you trust and what you're skeptical of.
Can you give an example?
Sure. If your perceptual filter says consciousness is produced by the brain, then when you see evidence of consciousness existing outside the brain, like remote viewing or precognition or UAPs, your brain will automatically dismiss it or reinterpret it. You won't even see it clearly. Your filter will distort it.
But that's just normal skepticism. That's how science works. You need evidence.
Is it? Or is it a perceptual filter masquerading as objectivity? Because here's the thing. The scientific method itself is based on certain assumptions. That reality is material, that consciousness is subjective, that only things we can measure are real. Those aren't objective truths, they're assumptions. They're perceptual filters.
Okay, but if we don't have some framework for understanding reality, we'd be lost. We need some shared assumptions.
Absolutely. But the problem is, we've forgotten that they're assumptions. We've mistaken the map for the territory. We think the materialist framework is the truth, when it's actually just one possible way of perceiving reality. And that mistake is locking us into a very limited construct.
So what's the alternative? What would a different perceptual filter look like?
Darius talks about this. He says the alternative is what he calls soul intelligence. Instead of filtering reality through the lens of materialism and fear and external authority, you filter it through direct knowing, intuition, and trust in your own perception. You become what he calls irreplaceable, a consciousness that can't be controlled or manipulated because it's accessing truth directly.
But how do you access truth directly? Doesn't everyone think they're accessing truth directly?
They're a pummit. But there's a difference between thinking you're accessing truth and actually being connected to the source of truth. And Darius says that source is accessible through what he calls the great work, a process of expanding consciousness, of accessing higher dimensions of awareness, of learning to perceive beyond the filters.
And the AYDA method is how you do that?
That's one way. But before we get into the method, we need to understand something else. Why are these perceptual filters so powerful? Why is it so hard to break free from them?
Why?
Because they're not just individual, they're collective. They're embedded in the culture, in the language, in the institutions, and more importantly, they're reinforced constantly. Every time you turn on the news, every time you go to school, every time you interact with authority, you're getting reinforcement of the dominant narrative.
So it's like we're all hypnotized?
In a way, yes. We're in a collective trance, a consensus reality that we've all agreed to believe in. And the problem is, once you're in the trance, you can't see that you're in it. You think it's just reality.
But some people do see it. Some people do wake up.
Yes. And that's where the narrative war becomes visible, because when someone starts to see through the filters, when they start to question the dominant narrative, they become a threat, not because they're dangerous, but because their awakening could trigger others' awakening, and that could shift the collective consciousness.
So there's pressure to keep people asleep?
Enormous pressure. Not always conscious pressure, but systemic pressure. The system is designed to keep people locked into the dominant narrative. And anyone who threatens that through their questions, their research, their experiences, gets marginalized, ridiculed, or silenced.
Is that what's happening with UAPs? Are they being suppressed?
Partially, but it's more subtle than that. The narrative around UAPs keeps shifting. First, they don't exist. Then they're military technology. Then they're a national security threat. Then they're a scientific mystery. By constantly shifting the narrative, authorities keep people confused. They keep the phenomenon from settling into a clear perception.
So the narrative war is about preventing clarity?
Exactly. Because clarity would lead to questions. Questions would lead to expanded consciousness. Expanded consciousness would lead to people recognizing their own power, and that would threaten the current power structure.
But why? What's wrong with people recognizing their power?
Nothing's wrong with it, but it's a threat to anyone who's benefiting from the current system. If people realized they were co-creating reality, that they had the power to shift the construct, they wouldn't accept war, poverty, environmental destruction. They wouldn't accept being controlled or manipulated.
So the narrative war is really about control?
Yes. Control of consciousness, control of perception, control of what becomes real in the collective mind. And Darius is very clear about this. He says the only way to break free from that control is to access consciousness that can't be controlled, to develop what he calls dimensional awareness, the ability to perceive beyond the filters, to access information directly from the field of consciousness itself.
And that's not possible for most people right now.
Most people are locked into a very narrow bandwidth of perception. They're operating through the filters that have been installed. But Darius says it's possible for anyone to expand beyond those filters. It requires work, it requires intention, but it's possible.
What kind of work?
That's where we're getting into the practical stuff, because Darius doesn't just theorize about this. He offers specific methods, specific practices, ways to actually shift your consciousness, to expand your perceptual filters to access higher dimensions of awareness.
But before we get into the methods, I want to understand something. You're saying the current narrative is designed to keep us asleep, but what if the current narrative is actually true? What if materialism is correct? What if consciousness is just produced by the brain?
Then we're in trouble. Because if consciousness is just produced by the brain, then you have no power. You're just a biological machine. You're a victim of circumstance. You have no agency in creating reality. And that's exactly what the current system wants you to believe.
So the narrative serves a purpose.
It serves a purpose for those in power. It keeps people passive, compliant, focused on external solutions instead of recognizing their own power. And Darius says that's the real issue we're facing. Not UAPs, not global events, not external threats. The real issue is whether we're going to wake up to our own power or stay asleep.
And UAPs are part of waking us up?
They're one catalyst among many. Climate change is another. Economic collapse is another. Pandemics, political polarization, technological disruption, all of these are forcing the collective consciousness to expand. They're breaking the old construct. And in that breaking, there's an opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
For something new. For a new construct based on consciousness instead of materialism. Based on connection instead of separation. Based on recognizing that we're all part of the same field, all participating in the same reality creation. And that's what Darius is pointing toward.
Okay, so the question becomes, how do we make that shift? How do we move from the old construct to the new one?
That's the essential question. And it starts with understanding that you're not a victim of reality. You're a creator of it. And once you understand that, you can start to create consciously instead of unconsciously.
Which brings us to the next part of this conversation, soul intelligence versus brain thinking, because that's the real divide, isn't it? That's where the power is.
Exactly. Because the narrative war isn't really about facts or evidence. It's about which consciousness you're operating from. And that determines everything, what you perceive, what you believe, what you create.
All right, so this is the core distinction, right? Soul intelligence versus brain thinking. Let's break this down because I think a lot of people are going to be confused about what you mean.
Good, because this is crucial. Darius makes a very specific distinction here. Brain thinking is what most of us are doing most of the time. It's linear, reactive, filtered through fear and bias. It's the thinking that's shaped by your conditioning, your trauma, your cultural programming.
So brain thinking is just normal thinking?
It seems normal because we're all doing it, but it's actually very limited. Brain thinking operates within the perceptual filters we talked about. It can only process information that fits within those filters. It can only imagine possibilities that are consistent with the dominant narrative.
Give me an example.
Okay, so you see a UAP. Your brain thinking immediately goes, that's not real. It's a drone, it's a weather balloon, it's a hallucination, it's military technology. Your brain is trying to fit the phenomenon into existing categories. It's trying to make it safe, make it understandable, make it consistent with what you already believe.
But that's just being rational. That's just using logic.
Is it? Or is it using a very narrow form of logic that only accepts certain types of evidence? Because here's the thing. If you're operating from brain thinking, you'll never perceive the UAP clearly. You'll perceive it through the filter of your existing beliefs. You'll see what you expect to see, not what's actually there.
So what's soul intelligence? What's the alternative?
Soul intelligence is direct knowing. It's intuition. It's the ability to perceive reality without filtering it through your conditioning. When you're operating from soul intelligence, you see the UAP and you just know. You don't need to fit it into categories. You don't need external validation. You access the information directly.
But how? How do you access information directly?
That's where it gets interesting. Because Darius says soul intelligence isn't something you develop through thinking. It's something you access by getting out of the way of your thinking, by quieting the brain thinking, by accessing what he calls the dimensional awareness.
Okay, so dimensional awareness is different than soul intelligence?
Related, but different. Soul intelligence is the quality of knowing. Dimensional awareness is the ability to perceive multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. Most people are locked into perceiving only 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, but consciousness can access other dimensions.
What other dimensions?
Well, Darius talks about this through his explorations in out-of-body states. He describes navigating what he calls the 12 realms, different layers or dimensions of consciousness. Each realm has its own characteristics, its own laws, its own information. And when you can access those realms, you can perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously.
So he's literally traveling to other dimensions?
That's how he describes it. And he's not alone. There's a whole body of research on remote viewing, on out-of-body experiences, on what's called non-local consciousness. The idea that consciousness isn't confined to your body or your brain. It can access information from anywhere, anytime.
But how is that possible? Doesn't that violate physics?
Classical physics? Yes, but quantum physics, not necessarily. Quantum entanglement shows that particles separated by vast distances remain connected. Information can be transmitted non-locally. And if consciousness is quantum in nature, which some researchers like Penrose and Hameroff argue, then consciousness could also be non-local.
So consciousness could be accessing information from other dimensions through quantum entanglement?
Exactly. And that would explain a lot of things that brain thinking can't explain. Synchronicities, precognition, remote viewing, the fact that people report similar experiences in altered states of consciousness. They're all accessing the same dimensional information.
But if that's true, why doesn't everyone have access to that? Why is it so rare?
Because most people are locked into brain thinking. Their perceptual filters are so strong that they can't perceive beyond them. They're like someone who's been in a dark room their whole life. If you suddenly open the door to sunlight, they can't see. Their eyes aren't adjusted. They need time to expand their perception.
So dimensional awareness is like expanding your perceptual capacity.
Exactly. And Darius says this expansion is happening right now, collectively. The crises we're facing, climate change, political polarization, UAPs, everything, they're all forcing the collective consciousness to expand. They're forcing people out of brain thinking and into soul intelligence.
But not everyone is expanding, right? Some people are doubling down on brain thinking. They're getting more rigid, more defensive.
Yes, and that's part of the narrative war. Because if you're benefiting from the current system, if you have power and control under the current construct, you're going to resist expansion. You're going to try to keep people locked in brain thinking. You're going to reinforce the old narratives.
So there's a split happening? Some people are waking up, some people are doubling down?
Exactly. And Darius talks about this in terms of what he calls the great bifurcation. The idea that humanity is splitting into 2 paths. One path leads to greater consciousness, greater connection, greater understanding of our power. The other path leads to greater control, greater separation, greater dependence on external authorities.
And we're choosing which path to take?
Individually and collectively, yes. Every time you choose to operate from soul intelligence instead of brain thinking, you're choosing the path of expansion. Every time you question the dominant narrative, every time you trust your own perception, every time you access information directly, you're choosing that path.
But it's not easy. Brain thinking is comfortable. It's familiar. It's what we've been trained to do.
It's incredibly comfortable. And that's the trap. Because comfort is a sign that you're locked into the old construct. Real growth requires discomfort. It requires questioning. It requires being willing to not know.
Not know what?
Anything. Everything. Darius talks about this. He says one of the biggest obstacles to accessing soul intelligence is the need to know. The need to have everything figured out, categorized, understood. But soul intelligence operates in mystery. It operates in the unknown.
So you have to be comfortable with uncertainty?
More than comfortable, you have to embrace it. You have to recognize that uncertainty is actually where all possibility lives. The moment you think you know, you've closed the door to new information. You've locked yourself into a construct.
Okay, so the practice is to quiet brain thinking, to embrace uncertainty, to access soul intelligence. But how do you actually do that? What's the method?
That's where the AYDA method, that's where Darius's specific practices come in, because he's not just talking about this philosophically. He's offering concrete techniques for shifting from brain thinking to soul intelligence, for accessing dimensional awareness, for navigating the higher realms.
But before we get into the method, I want to understand something. You're saying that soul intelligence is accessing information directly. But what if that information is wrong? What if your intuition is just your bias?
Fair question. And that's where the distinction between soul intelligence and wishful thinking becomes important. Soul intelligence isn't about believing what you want to believe. It's about accessing what's actually true, regardless of whether you like it or not.
How do you know the difference?
Darius would say, you verify it, you test it. You see if it's consistent with your experience. You see if it leads to expansion or contraction. Soul intelligence always leads to expansion, to greater understanding, greater connection, greater power. Wishful thinking leads to contraction, to disappointment, to disconnection, to powerlessness.
So it's about the results?
Partially, but also about the quality of the knowing. When you're accessing soul intelligence, there's a certainty to it, not arrogance or rigidity, but a quiet knowing, a sense of alignment. Whereas brain thinking is always questioning itself, always looking for external validation.
Interesting. So the shift from brain thinking to soul intelligence is also a shift in how you relate to knowledge itself.
Exactly. You move from needing to know to trusting what you know. You move from seeking external authority to recognizing your own authority. You move from being a victim of reality to being a creator of it.
And that's what dimensional awareness enables?
Yes. Because once you can perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, once you can access information from the field directly, you realize that you're not separate from reality. You're not an observer looking at it from the outside. You're embedded in it. You're part of it. You're creating it. And that
changes everything.
It changes everything. Because suddenly you're not waiting for external solutions. You're not dependent on authorities or institutions. You're not locked into the dominant narrative. You're free to create consciously. You're free to participate in shifting the construct.
Which is what needs to happen right now.
Which is what's happening right now, whether we're conscious of it or not. The old construct is breaking down. The question is, are we going to consciously participate in creating the new one, or are we going to resist and suffer?
And UAPs are part of that process.
They're one catalyst. They're one way the universe is pushing us to expand, to question, to access dimensional awareness. Because once you can perceive UAPs clearly, not through the filter of fear or skepticism, but through soul intelligence, you realize something fundamental. Reality is much larger than you thought, and you have much more power than you thought.
Okay, so the next question is, how do we actually make this shift? How do we move from brain thinking to soul intelligence? How do we access dimensional awareness?
That's where we get into the practical work. That's where the ADI-YDA method, the specific practices, the techniques for expanding consciousness, that's where all of that comes in. Because theory is one thing, but actual transformation requires practice.
All right, so we've established the theory. We understand that consciousness creates reality. We understand the difference between brain thinking and soul intelligence. We understand dimensional awareness. Now let's get practical. What is the AYDA method? How does it work?
Okay, so AYDA stands for Accessing Your Dimensional Awareness, and it's Darius's systematic approach to expanding consciousness, to accessing higher dimensions, to developing what he calls irreplaceability, a state of consciousness that can't be controlled or manipulated because it's accessing truth directly.
So it's a method for accessing those other dimensions you're talking about.
Exactly. But it's more than just accessing them. It's about learning to navigate them. It's about bringing back information. It's about integrating those experiences into your daily life so that you're operating from soul intelligence all the time, not just in meditation or in altered states.
How long does it take? Is this something you can learn in a weekend, or is it a lifelong practice?
Both. There are foundational practices that you can learn relatively quickly, but the real work, the deep transformation, that's a lifelong journey. Darius is very clear about this. He's not selling quick fixes. He's offering a path, a real path that requires commitment and intention.
What are the foundational practices?
Well, the first thing is what Darius calls consciousness calibration. It's about learning to recognize different states of consciousness. Most people are locked into one state, the waking state, the brain thinking state. But there are many states available to you. Dream states, meditative states, out-of-body states, states of expanded awareness.
And you can learn to access those states deliberately.
Yes, and the first step is recognizing them, learning to notice the subtle shifts in consciousness, learning to recognize when you're in brain thinking versus when you're starting to access soul intelligence. It's like learning to recognize different frequencies.
Okay, but how do you actually do that? What's the practice?
Darius teaches several techniques. One is what he calls the observer practice. You learn to observe your thoughts without identifying with them. You learn to create space between your awareness and your thinking. And in that space, something interesting happens. You start to access information that's not coming from your conditioned mind.
Information from where?
From the field. From what Darius calls the source field, the underlying consciousness that everything emerges from. When you quiet your brain thinking, when you create that space, you can access information directly from the field. You can perceive things that are happening in other dimensions, other times, other places.
That sounds like remote viewing.
It's related. Remote viewing is a specific application of this principle, but the AYDA method is broader. It's about developing the capacity to access non-local information in any context. In meditation, in daily life, in dreams, in out-of-body states.
But how do you know the information you're receiving is accurate? How do you distinguish between imagination and genuine perception?
Great question. And Darius addresses this directly. He says there are several ways to verify. First, consistency. If you're accessing genuine information, it will be consistent across multiple sessions, multiple modalities. Second, predictive power. If the information is real, you can use it to predict future events or understand current events in new ways.
And the third?
Integration. Real information from soul intelligence leads to expansion, to greater understanding, to more power. False information, whether it's imagination or wishful thinking, leads to contraction, to confusion, to powerlessness. So you can verify by the results.
Okay, so you practice the observer practice, you learn to quiet your brain thinking, you access information from the field, and you verify it through consistency, predictive power, and integration. What's next?
Next is what Darius calls dimensional navigation. Once you've learned to access the field, you learn to navigate it deliberately.
You learn to move through different dimensions of consciousness. You learn to access what he calls the 12 realms.
Tell me about the 12 realms.
Darius describes them as different layers or frequencies of consciousness. Each realm has its own characteristics, its own inhabitants, its own information. Some are closer to physical reality. They look similar to the physical world. Others are more abstract, more energetic, more symbolic. And the higher you go, the more you're accessing pure consciousness, pure information, pure possibility.
And you can actually travel through these realms.
According to Darius, yes. Through out-of-body experiences, through lucid dreaming, through deep meditation, you can learn to navigate these realms consciously. And when you do, you bring back information that can transform your understanding of reality.
What kind of information?
Information about the nature of consciousness. Information about how reality is constructed. Information about your own potential. Information about what's happening on the planet at deeper levels. Information about UAPs, about interdimensional beings, about the true history of humanity.
So Darius has accessed information about UAPs through these methods?
He has, and he's very careful about how he presents it. He doesn't claim absolute certainty. He presents it as his experience, his perception, his understanding. But he's also very clear that others can verify this for themselves. They can learn the methods. They can access the same information.
But that requires a lot of trust, doesn't it? You have to trust that the method works before you verified it yourself.
You do. And Darius acknowledges that. He says the first step is always a leap of faith. You have to be willing to try the practices, to commit to them, to see what happens. But it's not blind faith. It's faith based on the fact that thousands of people have done this work and reported similar experiences.
So there's a community doing this.
Yes. There are people all over the world practicing the AYDA method, exploring consciousness, accessing higher dimensions, and they're reporting consistent experiences. They're verifying each other's findings. They're building a collective understanding of how consciousness works.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about consciousness creating reality. We've talked about the narrative war. We've talked about soul intelligence versus brain thinking. We've talked about dimensional awareness and the AYDA method. But I want to make sure we're landing this clearly. What's the core message here? What do you want people to take away from this conversation?
The core message is this: you are not a victim of reality. You are a creator of it. And right now, at this moment in history, that recognition is more important than it's ever been. Because the old construct is breaking down. The old narratives are failing. And we're in the process of creating something new.
And that's where the choice comes in?
Exactly. Because you can respond to this breakdown in two ways. You can go into fear. You can double down on the old narratives. You can try to control and manipulate and survive. Or you can wake up. You can recognize your power. You can access soul intelligence. You can participate consciously in creating the new construct.
And UAPs are part of that process?
UAPs are one catalyst among many. They're forcing us to expand our understanding of what's possible. They're forcing us to question the dominant narratives. They're forcing us to recognize that reality is much larger than we've been told. And that's exactly what we need right now.
So the message isn't UAPs are aliens or UAPs are a threat?
No. The message is UAPs are a mirror. They're reflecting back to us the state of our collective consciousness. They're showing us that we're ready to expand. They're inviting us to access dimensional awareness. They're catalyzing the shift from the old construct to the new one.
And Darius is offering a practical path for making that shift?
He is. Through the AYDA method, through the practices, through the teachings, he's offering a way for anyone to access their own power, to develop soul intelligence, to navigate multiple dimensions of consciousness, to become irreplaceable.
But it requires commitment.
It does. It requires being willing to question everything. It requires being willing to sit with uncertainty. It requires being willing to take responsibility for your own consciousness and your own reality creation.
But the reward is freedom.
Real freedom. The freedom that comes from knowing that you're not a victim, you're a creator.
Okay, so here's my final question. If someone is listening to this right now and they're feeling called to explore this further, what should they do?
First, I'd say trust that feeling. That calling you're experiencing, that's soul intelligence speaking. That's your higher consciousness recognizing something true. Don't dismiss it. Don't rationalize it away. Honor it.
And then?
Then, take action. Start with the foundational practices. Learn to quiet your brain thinking. Learn to access the observer state. Start exploring consciousness. Start verifying for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Don't take Darius's word for it. Test it. Experience it. Become your own authority.
And if they want to dive deeper into Darius's work specifically, what should they do?
Darius has courses, teachings, guided practices available. He has a whole body of work on consciousness, on the AYDA method, on navigating higher dimensions. I'd encourage people to explore that, to engage with the material, to see if it resonates, to see if it calls to something true within them.
All right, so we've had an incredible conversation here. We've explored consciousness and reality creation. We've talked about UAPs and global events as catalysts for transformation. We've talked about the narrative war and how to break free from it. We've talked about soul intelligence and dimensional awareness. We've talked about the AYDA method and practical transformation.
And the core message throughout has been, you have power. You have agency. You're not a victim of reality. You are a creator of it. And right now, at this moment in history, that recognition is more important than it's ever been.
So I want to ask our audience, did this conversation land for you? Did something resonate? Did you feel that calling to explore further?
If you did, we want to hear from you. Please leave a comment below. Tell us what resonated. Tell us what questions you still have. Tell us about your own experiences with consciousness, with soul intelligence, with accessing higher dimensions.
And if this conversation was valuable for you, please share it. Share it with people who you think need to hear this message. Because the shift that's happening right now, it's not going to happen through top-down solutions. It's going to happen through individual consciousness expanding. And every person who wakes up, every person who accesses soul intelligence, every person who recognizes their own power, that matters.
It absolutely matters. So please share this and please like this video. Your engagement helps us reach more people. It helps us continue this conversation. It helps us participate in the shift that's happening.
And most importantly, please subscribe to this channel because we're going to be continuing this exploration. We're going to be diving deeper into consciousness, into UAPs, into the transformation that's happening on the planet. We're going to be bringing you more perspectives, more teachings, more tools for accessing your own power.
This is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore, so much more to understand, and we want you to be part of this journey.
Now, we have 2 videos available for you right now on your screen. Both of them continue this exploration. Both of them go deeper into the material we've covered today. I want you to choose which one calls to you, which one feels aligned with where you are in your journey.
So choose the one that calls to you. Click on it. Continue your journey because this conversation doesn't end here. This is just the beginning of your exploration.
And remember this as you go forward. You are not a victim of reality. You are a creator of it. The power you are seeking is not outside of you. It's within you. It's always been within you. You just have to access it.
So access it. Explore it. Become irreplaceable. And participate consciously in creating the world that's trying to be born right now.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for engaging with this material. Thank you for being willing to question, to explore, to expand your consciousness. The future depends on people like you.
Now go, choose your next video, continue your journey. And remember, the reality you create starts with the consciousness you access.